Hey everyone, how's it going? This is Waj, and as you all know, I got the PS4 very recently, just got it this Friday, and having a great time with it. But one of the things I really want to do is see how the PS4 has evolved and changed from its early generations. And as you can see over here, we kind of have a brief history of the evolution of the Sony PlayStation. And beginning at the very right, we have the first generation PlayStation 1, the PlayStation 2 right beside it. Then logically, we have the first generation PlayStation 3 and the new PS4 right beside that. Now the history of Sony actually making gaming consoles goes all the way back to the late 80s, where ironically Nintendo commissioned Sony to develop a CD-ROM add-on attachment to their Super NES that they were developing. Now that relationship eventually went south due to financial disagreements between how the revenue would be split up between the two giant companies. Now the result of that feud actually fueled Sony to develop their own gaming console that would compete with the Nintendo Super NES. And this was really the genesis of the PlayStation 1 that you're seeing right now. Now Sony released the first generation PlayStation 1 in Japan back in 1994. A year later, we saw the Western version of the PlayStation 1, which went on to eventually sell more than 100 million units all around the world. Now the PlayStation 2 followed up the release of the PS1 back in 2000. Now from a technical angle, the PlayStation 2 was more than 10 times more powerful than its previous generation. And from a design perspective, you can see that it was the first console to introduce that vertical standing position that is still kept in the new PlayStation 4. Now since the PlayStation 2 also used the DVD-ROM format instead of the CD-ROM format of the original PlayStation, the gaming and media content became a lot more rich and detailed. So it's certainly not surprising when many people say that some of their favorite games of all time were on the PS2, such as Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3 and Shadow of the Colossus. Furthermore, since the PS2 had amazing hardware driving outstanding gaming content, it's no surprise that we find out that the PS2 is actually one of the most sold gaming consoles ever made, selling more than 150 million units all around the world. Now when we take a look at the PlayStation 3 from a financial standpoint, it definitely didn't perform up to the original PlayStation, and of course not to the PlayStation 2's levels, selling just under 80 million and counting. And perhaps one of the reasons for that loss was because of its really high price tag. In fact, when the PlayStation 3 first came out, it was double the price of when the PlayStation 2 came out, selling at over $600. Now even though the PlayStation 3 came in at a very heavy price tag, it did offer a lot for your money. Firstly, it was one of the best HD media consumption device you can get out there. It had a large hard drive where you can store your movies, photos, and music. Moreover, since the PlayStation 3 had a built-in Blu-ray player, it became extremely sought after by home theater enthusiasts and anybody trying to get Blu-ray at their home at a reasonable price, because most standalone Blu-ray players at the time were retailing for about the same price as a PS3. Now technically the PlayStation 3 was leaps and bounds above the PlayStation 2. It was the first to actually introduce the cell processor architecture, which was kind of an Achilles heel for developers because although it was very powerful, capable of delivering full high-definition 1080p gaming at considerably high frame rates at the time, but many developers have claimed that it was quite difficult to utilize that specific hardware and architecture on the PlayStation 3, especially when they're making cross-platform games. However, exclusive game titles such as The Last of Us and Uncharted are a tribute to what the cell processor is really capable of when a developer is exclusively making games for the PlayStation. Now, I personally think that the design of the original fat 2006 PlayStation 3 is one of the best looking consoles of all time in my opinion. For one, I love the curved architecture of the design. It was also the only generation of PlayStation where we actually saw multimedia card readers right at the front of the device, making it very convenient to import photos from your digital camera, to put in music in there, videos, whatever. It was also the first generation to actually get hacked, which caused a lot of problems for Sony, but definitely expanded the horizons of what a gaming console can do. Now looking at the PlayStation 4, you could see the small little cues that it takes from its previous generation consoles. It certainly is very reminiscent of the PlayStation 2 with its more square, boxy design. Obviously it's a little bit more angular, but in terms of overall feel and overall design aesthetic, I think it's probably most closest representative to the PlayStation 2, and perhaps Sony is trying to channel some of that PS2 energy to the PS4. Maybe they're thinking that they could sell another 150 million units like the PS2 and completely destroy the Xbox One. Now, another cool thing that we can take a look at is the evolution of the PlayStation controller. Here on the very right hand side, you can see that we have the original PlayStation 1 controller, the original controller. Now, after the release of the original PlayStation controller, Sony released back in 1997 the dual analog controller, which introduced the dual analog sticks that we've come to know with the PlayStation controller, and then the original Dualshock controller, which obviously introduced the rumble aspect of the controller. So as you can see, the original controller didn't actually come with those dual analog sticks that the PlayStation controller is so famous for. So therefore, with this original controller, you are limited in terms of what games you can actually play. You can't really play too many racing games or driving simulators, such as the famous Gran Turismo series or Need for Speed series. You can't really do any first-person shooters. Mind you, there weren't many first-person shooters out for the original PlayStation, but all things considered, in terms of the feel and ergonomics of this controller, it feels very similar all the way up to Dualshock 3. Now, the Dualshock 2 is pretty much identical to the first analog Dualshock controller, besides some very minor aesthetic differences. Now, one of the things that made the Dualshock 1 and 2 different from every other rumble controllers is that it actually had dual vibration motors, making it very powerful and much more responsive than other rumble controllers out there. Now, additionally, when it comes to the dual analog thumbsticks, one of the great things is the overall texture and feel and overall grip that you get with the rubberized controller, which is certainly better than what Nintendo and other people were doing with a more plasticky, slick finish on the thumbsticks. Now, another great thing is when you press on the thumbsticks, you actually unlock another button, another way to interact with your game by enabling the L3 and R3 buttons. Now, after the Dualshock 2, they actually went to the Sixaxis controller when the PlayStation 3 first launched, which didn't have any rumble feature because of a certain lawsuit that they had to clear up before they could make the Dualshock 3. But once the lawsuit cleared up, they made the Dualshock 3. As you can see over here, it's pretty much the same controller as we saw previously in the Dualshock 1, but now obviously it's wireless. It has the 6-axis feature, which is one of the first motion sensitive controllers to ever be made, so therefore it was pretty groundbreaking for the time. Now, lastly but not least, we have the brand new, pretty much redesigned Dualshock 4 controller. This obviously comes bundled into the PlayStation 4, and one of the big things is that they've completely revamped the Dualshock design. Firstly, the entire shape of the controller is slightly modified to be a little bit more ergonomically friendly with most people's hands, which is certainly true, and it has a rubberized back, which is better for grip. And for the first time in any major console controller, we have a touchpad at the center of the controller, which is going to unlock different controlling abilities depending on what game you're playing. I'm playing Killzone right now, which has a couple of features that it utilizes the touchpad for, such as changing the abilities of your weapon or switching stuff. You can obviously probably customize it in the future, but it's definitely going to unlock different gaming capabilities of the controller. Now, at the very front of the controller, we have a multicolored LED light, which is going to actually help out the PlayStation camera to track your different movements of the controller, and it works really well in terms of that. The downside is it uses quite a bit of battery life, so I only managed to get about 8 hours versus the previous generation Dualshock 3 got almost 30 hours. Now, the cool thing is you can charge the controller when the console is in standby mode, and obviously most people are probably going to even just connect it, use a longer cord to keep that thing always charging, because the battery life is quite low considering what the Dualshock 3 did. Now, the last thing that we're going to do is take a look at the graphical progression of a single gaming franchise and see how the different consoles cope. We're going to start with the PlayStation 1, and we're going to look at the Need for Speed franchise. Now, obviously, there's a whole bunch of Need for Speed games that have been made, but we're going to take a look at some of the ones that I like and some of the ones that kind of show the graphical improvements of each kind of hardware. Now, as you can see from the original Need for Speed game playing on the PlayStation 1, the graphical performance is pretty dated from our standpoint, but definitely when it came out back in 1994 in Japan, I'm sure people were really blown away by the 3D capabilities of a CD-based gaming console. Now we're going to move on to Need for Speed Underground for the PlayStation 2, and you're going to notice a huge difference in terms of graphical performance. This game definitely shows off what the PlayStation 2 could do. One of the amazing things that I've noticed right off the bat is how smooth this game runs at. It definitely runs more than 60 frames per second, which is certainly amazing, especially when we take a look at the hardware that was inside the PlayStation 2 at the time. Now we're going to switch gears to a more graphically intensive game when comparing the PS3 to the PS4. We're going to switch to Battlefield 4, and this game is going to really illustrate well the differences between the two in terms of hardware. Now the PS4 is using a Jaguar-based AMD processor, which is effectively an 8-core chip with like 8 gigs of GDDR5 and a very, very powerful graphics processor inside, as well as the general CPU, and you have a whole lot of memory bandwidth to do a lot of impressive things. It's basically a very high performance PC in a $400 box. Now, reviewing this gameplay footage of Battlefield 4 side by side, you'll notice that there's a lot of different texture details and a lot more color depth in everything that you're looking at, as well as a generally higher frame rate. When we take a look at a lot of these scenes, you'll notice that things run a little bit smoother. Obviously, this is slowed down a little bit to see judderly effects and to see more anti-aliasing stuff, and to see different gradual changes of water and different texture popping and things like that. And you'll see that the PS3 has to simplify a lot of different textures. It has a less of a throw distance in terms of how far you can look back, and there's a lot of color information, a lot more depth into the PS4 image, as well as having a generally higher frame rate. Now, what you can see from a video is the detail. Now, they're both really 1080p consoles. There's not a lot of difference in terms of that, but there is a different level of detail that you get within the 1080p image of the PS4 and the 1080p image that you get on the PS3. You get a lot more information, a lot more essentially pixels that are much more refined than the PS3. So when playing different graphically intensive games, you can definitely see that in person. Is very difficult to judge on a video, so never judge anything that's really on YouTube. So really what you have to do is go out there and find a PS4 from your friend or at the store and see if you can really tell by yourself without somebody pointing out different details or things like that. Again, trust your eye, because that's what you view your world through. So other than that, guys, thank you so much for watching my brief little history on the PlayStation console and really see how the design has progressed, and kind of give you guys a brief kind of introduction into what the PS4 can do and how it compares against its older generation. But if you like this video, please make sure to give us a thumbs up and share it if you can. It really helps us out tremendously, and keep on the lookout for my PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and Wii U comparison. That's kind of like a console war for this generation of console gamers out there. So that'll be coming up very soon, and thank you so much again. We'll see you later. Take care.